The Church of England, quite unique in Christian church history, famously known among lay people somewhat knowledgeable about European and church history as the church that started due to a king wanting a divorce. While the summation is not entirely accurate and a bit controversial, controversy is sort of the name of the game when it comes to the Church of England, both its formation and its breaking away from the Catholic Church. A bit of a disclaimer to start, I do use the term Church of England, sometimes synonymous with the Anglican Communion. Of course, the historical Church of England and the Anglican Communion are not the same thing. The Church of England eventually became the Anglican Communion, and I understand how that might get confusing throughout this video. However, context clues should clear up any misunderstanding. Generally understood today to be a mainline Protestant denomination, with radical changes currently causing divisions and splits within the congregation, it claims to be Catholic in the traditional and literal sense of the word, Reformed, and also embraces the descriptor of evangelical, despite its rather contentious connotations in modern church discourse. Also interesting to point out are the claims that some historians make that British and specifically English Euroscepticism may have started with the church's break from Rome. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but it is interesting to point out that the church's geography places it uniquely in European and church history, and this is a geography channel after all. To speak about the history of the church, you really do have to start with King Henry VIII and probably even back a generation before him. King Henry VII, his father, had two legitimate children with his wife Elizabeth of York, Henry VIII being the second son and behind his older brother Arthur in the line of royal succession. Ironically enough, the second son in line would carry the name of his father and become king, while the eldest, and first in line for the throne, would be used as pretty much a political bargaining tool in an alliance with Spain, being betrothed to none other than Catherine of Aragon. Given we all know how the story goes, it is no surprise to learn that Arthur died only 6 months after marrying Catherine, leaving Henry to be first in line for the throne, and subsequently being betrothed to Catherine. Now, it is important to give some historical context and mention Henry's childhood and how he differed from his father. While his father, King Henry VII, was often seen as cold, shrewd, unfriendly, and sometimes called the Winter King, due to his demeanor and attitude, and likely due to his harsh taxation policies to keep the country's finances afloat after the War of the Roses, Henry was viewed much more favorably as a prince, and even in his early reign. While Arthur, his older brother, was used to bargain alliances and being groomed for leadership, Henry was charismatic, played sports, and was active. He wrote plays and poetry, and probably most important of all, he was very pious, being trained and well-educated for a career in the church. Throughout much of his life, and still early into his reign, he was devoutly Catholic and held great adoration for the Pope and the Church. This piousness led him to be initially skeptical of his eventual betrothal to Catherine of Aragon, being his brother's widow. There is a verse in Leviticus stating that any man who marries his brother's widow will be cursed to have no children. Given Henry's piousness and adoration for his faith, this posed an initial issue for him, despite the fact that he had grown very fond of Catherine by the point of their marriage when he was 17. At the time of the betrothal, Henry was about to turn 12, while Catherine was 17. Henry even repudiated the betrothal at age 14. Henry did claim the betrothal was made without his consent, but this was likely due to political reasons and under heavy influence from his father. Eventually, Henry turned 17 and inherited the English throne, and he did marry Catherine after a papal dispensation in 1503, which recognized the marriage as valid. This was legitimized by the church, hinged on a few theological arguments. A large point was that Catherine insisted her marriage to Arthur was never consummated. Now, I am no expert on European royal sexual behavior in the 16th century, but given she was married for 6 months, this may be hard to believe by modern minds. Regardless, she did insist on this fact, which was a large reason as to why the blessing by the church was issued. Another reason was a verse in Deuteronomy which seems to specifically command the marrying of a brother's widow if they had no children. This tension and in some sense outright contradiction opened the door for the authority of the church to determine the validity of the marriage. Which leads to the third reason the church potentially recognized the marriage: papal and church authorities superseding non-church authorities in terms of theological understanding in the context of secular policy, as well as the Pope's authority to supersede impediments under canon law. So the papal dispensation recognized the marriage as valid. All this squared away, Henry married Catherine in 1509 after turning 17 and inheriting the English throne. All things considered, this was understood to be a happy marriage at first, and as stated before, Henry's father was fairly unpopular, but at least at first, Henry was viewed as a breath of fresh air. He was less frugal, more charismatic, thought to be handsome and likable. He had 2 royal bloodlines, which made his perception, in the eyes of the common people, well fit for leadership. Today, when we see leaders with a long lineage in politics, we become skeptical, but this was not the case in the 16th century. One has to understand how the common person saw the role of leadership at the time, as chosen by God to rule the nation. Character and inherent capacity for this task was seen as essential for good leadership, and a long line of leadership, good or bad, was a necessary condition for royalty. A nobody peasant becoming king may be seen as exciting or admirable, but the lack of royal blood within him would be a cause for concern for most of the common people, and especially the nobility. After a little over a decade of what seemed like a fruitful marriage, Henry had a crisis on his hands. Only one of his children, Mary I, had survived infancy. He was left with no male heir, and his adoration of his beloved wife started to fade. He seemed to blame her directly, as he was able to conceive an illegitimate son with one of his mistresses, Elizabeth Blount. Henry began to believe his marriage was cursed, and looked to his old friend Leviticus and began to believe that his marriage was never seen as valid in God's eyes. It is important to note the tension here between politics and theology. This may have been political opportunism on Henry's part, given his lack of a male heir, as well as his fondness for who would eventually become his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Despite this obvious secular or political dynamic, we should not forget that Henry was in fact very pious and believed deeply in the church, and was well educated in scripture and theology. These things meant a great deal to him. And if you do take Leviticus seriously, as Henry very clearly did, it may make sense why he did not have a male heir. This very well could be theology influencing political opportunism, or simply just theology. Regardless, he began to believe, for either theological or political reasons, or perhaps both, that his marriage needed to end for him to have an heir. He put forth the argument based on the verse in Leviticus that his marriage was never valid in God's eyes, had been cursed, and the church ought to issue an annulment. Now, of course, an annulment is different from a divorce, one being the end of a valid marriage, and the other determining that the marriage was never valid to begin with. Annulments were not unheard of. Marriages did require mutual consent, typically of both arranging families involved, and if it was determined that consent was not obtained in good faith, marriages could be annulled. Despite this, they were still pretty rare among the nobility and common people alike. On top of Henry's scriptural arguments, he did argue that the Pope cannot override divine law, which really does have some echoes of the ongoing Protestant Reformation, which these events really are right in the middle of. Henry brought these arguments to Pope Clement VII, who was placed in a precarious position. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, had just sacked Rome, and the Pope was under significant imperial pressure. This of course mattered because Charles was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Granting an annulment would be seen as an insult or outright defiance to Charles V, who held great power over the church at the time. It is important to mention at this point that popes throughout history were often used as political tools as they were used as theological sources of power. The church operated much in the way of a state in some sense, at times holding power and at other times being subservient to secular powers. The Pope overriding and therefore undermining the previous Pope's decree would also complicate matters in the Church and create a dangerous precedent at a time where the Pope's authority was being questioned throughout Europe. Despite this, keeping good faith with England during a time of instability of the Church was also something to be considered. Clement therefore seemingly delayed, taking over half a decade to decide on the matter, all the while Henry growing fond of Anne Boleyn. Eventually, Clement refused to grant an annulment, and this was seen as the safest move for the church at the time, backed up by theological arguments derived from Deuteronomy and papal authority. Despite Henry's attempts to resolve things within the church, including through the chief minister Thomas Wolsey, Henry was to remain wed to Catherine. This, of course, infuriated Henry, who quickly moved to consolidate clerical power within his country and have them submit directly to him rather than Rome. This took place in 1532, and while not formalized in any law or doctrine, it made Henry the effective head of the English Church. But it didn't take long. In 1533, the Act in Restraint of Appeals disallowed any appeals to Rome, and in the following year, 1534, with the Act of Supremacy, it was officially declared that the English monarch was the supreme head of the Church of England. This is seen as the official start of the Church of England as a separate entity from Rome, and a key point in the English Reformation. During the Act of Restraints of Appeals and the Act of Supremacy, Thomas Cranmer, now an authority in the Church not bound by the constraints of Rome, officially annulled Henry's marriage to Catherine in May 1533. Henry technically married his second wife, Anne Boleyn, a few months before this annulment was even granted. At this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about schism. It is generally understood that the Church of England, and by extension the Anglican Communion that we know today, is a mainline Protestant denomination. It is generally assumed that the mainline Protestants like Lutherans and Presbyterians, as well as others, are not technically schismatic, as they were forcefully removed from the Church, and there is of course plenty of historical evidence to back this up. The Church of England, however, does not really follow this pattern. Individuals among the Church were eventually excommunicated, but the formation of an English Church outside of Rome's authority moved first to remove itself, which one could argue is schism. However, that is really only germane to the topic of which church is the true church and which church is descended from the apostles and which counts as real Christians and all that, which is not within the scope of this video. However, I did want to point it out. Back to the topic of this video, initially after breaking with Rome, the church's moves were theologically conservative but politically radical. Monasteries were sacked and their wealth was confiscated by the state, which had helped the debt the English crown accrued, which may be argued as another political motive for the break. There was also, of course, the English Bible, making scriptures available to laypersons who were literate in England. Upheld were the Catholic views of the sacraments, including transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, and overall the same basic theological and scriptural understandings as traditional Catholic teachings. So initially, the Church of England was really Catholicism without the Pope, or arguably Catholicism with Henry taking the role of the Pope in some sense, at least for England. Henry would eventually die in 1547 and had his son succeed him, his only surviving legitimate son, Edward VI, whose mother was Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. He pushed for further Protestant reforms, changing the theology of the Church. This includes the Book of Common Prayer, changing the faith significantly and shaping it into the Anglican faith we know it today. It standardized worship in English, marriage rites, baptism, communion, and funerals. Statues, images, and relics were destroyed for fear of idolatry. Protestant doctrine was also formalized in the 42 Articles, which adopted salvation by faith, rejection of the teachings of purgatory, and influenced sacramental theology, aligning it more with Protestant and Reformed teachings. Mary I, Henry's daughter with Catherine, would ascend to the throne as well. She would attempt to restore relations with Rome, and she would execute over 200 Protestants while oppressing countless others. Full, complete, and lasting restoration inevitably failed, likely due to her short reign. Her successor, Elizabeth I, reoriented the Church back towards Protestantism and shaped the Church more completely to what we know and recognize as the Anglican Communion. Throughout the years since Elizabeth, through subsequent monarchs and influential people within the Church, the Anglican Communion, as we know it today, would slowly develop. But it really does start with the Church of England's break from Rome. The Church of England's history is messy, it is complicated, and there are so many details that do not fit into the scope of any single documentary, book, or lecture. For more reading, sources are in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe for more videos of all sorts of topics tangentially related to geography.